A violent storm ripped through the wilderness, burying the world in an unrelenting wave of white. Amid the fury of wind and snow, a small, nearly lifeless creature appeared, barely clinging to survival. That one fragile moment would set in motion a chain of events leading to an unimaginable truth. What happens when a simple act of kindness uncovers a secret so deep it changes everything? Keep watching for a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. If you're captivated, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment to tell us where you're watching from. The wind howled fiercely as a blizzard descended upon the Montana wilderness. The sky was an impenetrable gray, and the air felt like needles, each gust stinging every inch of exposed skin. The temperature had plummeted to a staggering -48 degrees Fahrenheit, an intensity that could freeze the breath mid-air. For anyone caught outside, it was a death sentence. This was the kind of cold that gripped the land and refused to let go a storm so brutal that it seemed the earth itself was being swallowed whole by the snow. Among the few who lived in this harsh landscape, there was Grant Harlan, a retired Army veteran who had spent most of his life in the service of his country, and then in quiet solitude in the wilds of Montana. His cabin, tucked deep in the snow-covered mountains, was both his refuge and his prison. A man who had fought battles in foreign lands, Grant had now found peace, he thought, away from the world, surrounded only by the wind and snow. But today, as he sat before the fire, his mind was far from the comfort of the warmth. It was as though something he couldn't quite place stirred in the cold outside, pulling at him, urging him to pay attention. He tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to him. The crackling of the fire did little to dispel the chill deep in his bones. Grant was no stranger to cold. He had been through some of the harshest winters in the Army, but this felt different. The wind outside seemed more desperate, more relentless. He peered through the small cabin window, watching the snow whip through the trees, bending them like fragile twigs under the force of the wind. The thermometer on the porch read an unimaginable temperature, -48 degrees Fahrenheit. Grant knew this storm wasn't just cold. It was a force of nature that would test even the most hardened survivors. As the storm raged on, he poured himself another cup of coffee and tried to settle back into his chair, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the wilds outside. It was then that he heard it. At first it was so faint that he wondered if it was just the wind playing tricks on him, but as the seconds stretched on, the sound grew louder. A soft, almost tentative scratching at the door. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting company, not in a storm like this. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and there was no way anyone would be foolish enough to venture out in this kind of weather. The scratching came again, more persistent this time. It was weak, hesitant, like something was trying to get his attention. He stood up, the floor creaking under his boots, and walked to the door. The storm was so intense outside that he could barely see past the small porch, but the sound was unmistakable. He opened the door cautiously, his breath catching, as a gust of wind slammed into him, icy and biting. For a moment, all he could see was the white of the snow swirling in the air, a violent blur of nothingness. But then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw it. A small, shivering figure collapsed at his feet. A tiny German shepherd puppy, no older than a few months, its fur matted and caked with ice, its body trembling violently. It barely had the strength to lift its head, its eyes glassy from exhaustion and frostbite. Grant's heart sank as he knelt down to inspect the pup, feeling its tiny ribs through the thin fur. The puppy's small body was ice cold, and it was barely breathing. It had stumbled into the storm alone and abandoned, searching for any semblance of safety. Grant could see the faint tracks in the snow, tiny paw prints leading up to his door, evidence of the desperate journey the puppy had made. Without hesitation, Grant scooped the pup into his arms, closing the door behind him and locking out the frigid air. He hurried toward the warmth of the fireplace, his mind racing as he cradled the small animal in his hands. The storm outside continued its fury, but inside the warmth of the fire beckoned. He laid the puppy on a soft blanket, pulling another blanket over it, trying to shield it from the cold. The pup's tiny form was so fragile, so vulnerable. Grant could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, the little dog wouldn't survive the storm. His hands were steady as he moved to fetch a bowl of warm water, hoping to coax the puppy to drink. The pup's body was trembling uncontrollably, its eyes half-lidded from exhaustion. Grant spoke softly, his voice soothing, as he ran his hand over the puppy's fur. "Come on, little one," he whispered. "You're safe now." He watched as the pup's nose twitched, sensing the warmth, but it was too weak to lift its head. With a careful touch, Grant lifted its head and gently tipped the bowl to its lips. The puppy licked at the water weakly, the smallest signs of life beginning to return. But the storm outside was still raging, and time was running out. He couldn't help but feel that if he failed, this small creature wouldn't survive the night. Grant stoked the fire higher, the flames crackling as they grew brighter, the warmth slowly filling the room. He settled into the chair beside the puppy, watching as it began to breathe a little easier. Its small chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. He didn't know where it had come from or how it had ended up outside in such a perilous storm, but one thing was clear. This puppy was now his responsibility. For better or worse, they were bound together by fate. As the minutes passed, Grant remained by the puppy's side, his eyes fixed on the small form beneath the blankets. He couldn't help but wonder what had happened to its family, or if it had even had one. There was no sign of any other animals nearby, no tracks in the snow leading away from the cabin. It was as if the puppy had been abandoned, cast out into the storm to face its fate alone. Grant had seen his share of loss of people and of comrades, but this felt different. The weight of the puppy's fragile existence seemed to be pulling at him, tugging at a part of him he hadn't felt in years. The cold outside was relentless, but in this small cabin the storm felt a little less savage. As the fire crackled and the puppy's breathing steadied, Grant allowed himself a moment of peace. It made Grant feel like the world was closing in on him, that even the walls of his sanctuary couldn't keep the violence of nature at bay. He knew he had to act fast. Time was running out. The puppy was still weak, its small body covered in frostbite and shivering uncontrollably. Grant's heart clenched as he watched it, feeling an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He couldn't just sit back and let the pup fade away in front of him. It had no one else. It was a living creature and it deserved to survive. Grant had spent enough time in life fighting for his own survival. Now he had someone else to fight for. He pushed aside his own worries, focused entirely on the task at hand. The fire crackled louder as Grant stoked it higher, the flames flickering with renewed life. He stood up and walked to the small cabinet by the door, retrieving a metal bowl and filling it with warm water. His movements were careful and deliberate. As he approached the puppy, he noticed its eyes fluttering open, blinking slowly, as if trying to adjust to the warmth. He gently placed the bowl in front of the pup's nose, hoping it would respond to the scent. It hesitated at first, but then, as if guided by instinct, the puppy licked the water. Grant watched closely, his heart pounding in his chest. The smallest sign of life, the smallest effort to survive, meant everything. The puppy drank weakly, its small body trembling with every sip. Grant's fingers brushed against its fur as he gently petted it, trying to reassure it, though he felt just as uncertain about the outcome as the pup. He wanted to believe that the worst was over, that it would be okay, but he knew better than to assume anything. Survival wasn't guaranteed, not in a storm like this. It was a fight against the cold, a battle that required both time and patience. He had learned that much in his years of service. Every decision could be a matter of life or death, and he couldn't afford to make a mistake. He moved slowly, adjusting the blankets around the puppy's tiny form, giving it more warmth, covering its exposed sides. The small creature seemed to settle in a little more, its shivering less violent, but still persistent. Grant couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this way about another living being. He'd spent most of his life keeping to himself, building walls around his heart, learning to trust only himself. But here in the silence of his cabin, with the storm howling outside, everything was different. The tiny puppy was not just a creature in need. It was something more, something that pulled at a part of him that had been buried for years. As he sat back down, his gaze fixed on the small figure in front of him, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The fire crackled beside him, the warmth filling the room, but the coldness in his chest began to thaw ever so slightly. The storm outside raged on, but the cabin felt like an island of warmth and life, a fragile sanctuary amidst the chaos. Grant's thoughts drifted to his time in the army, to the battles fought and lost, to the comrades he had left behind. But those memories felt distant, disconnected, like something that belonged to another man, another life. He looked down at the puppy again. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel quite so alone. The sound of the wind outside shook him from his thoughts. He reached over and grabbed a nearby blanket, draping it over himself and the puppy. He wanted to protect it, to keep it warm, to help it heal. The storm might rage on outside, but here in this small corner of the world, Grant would not let the puppy suffer. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about giving the pup a chance to live. The fire crackled, and the minutes seemed to stretch on as he sat there keeping vigil over the small creature curled in the blanket. Every so often, the puppy's tail would twitch, or it would give a soft sigh, signaling that it was still with him. Every small sign of life, no matter how faint, was a victory. But Grant knew this was just the beginning. The storm outside was only growing fiercer. The temperature was dropping even lower, and with it came the realization that if the puppy was to survive the night, it would need more than just warmth. It would need nourishment, rest, and time, and it would need Grant's undivided attention. He couldn't afford to think about anything else. He couldn't afford to leave the cabin or even look away. If he did, the puppy might not make it. Grant glanced once more at the thermometer outside -48 degrees Fahrenheit. He couldn't imagine what it would take to survive out there in such extreme cold. But in here, in this cabin, there was hope. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that he could make a difference. He could save this puppy. He could give it the chance it had been denied in the wild. The thought brought a strange sense of purpose to his heart. As the storm raged on, Grant Harlan and the little German Shepherd puppy were bound together, linked by the fight for survival, and something deeper, something unspoken. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending small embers floating up into the chimney, and Grant sat in his chair watching the tiny German Shepherd puppy closely. It had been several hours since he'd found it on his doorstep, and the small creature had begun to show signs of life. Its breathing had steadied, and the frantic shivering had lessened. Grant had done everything he could think of to help. He kept the puppy warm, fed it small amounts of water, and wrapped it in blankets to protect it from the cold. Yet despite all his efforts, the puppy's recovery seemed slow, too slow for Grant's liking. Each time he checked, the puppy's eyes would flicker open for a few moments, before it would fall back into a restless sleep. It was as if the little animal's body had been drained of all its energy, and was now simply hanging on, waiting for something, anything, to bring it back. Grant's gaze moved over the small form, his heart heavy with uncertainty. He had no experience with animals like this, no clue about what the puppy needed to truly survive. All he had were his instincts honed over years of living in the wilderness. But this was different. This wasn't a battle against the elements alone. This was a battle for life itself. As he sat there feeling the weight of the puppy's fragile existence pressing down on him, a sudden, almost imperceptible movement caught his attention. The puppy stirred slightly, its tail twitching, before it let out a weak whine. Grant's heart skipped a beat. He quickly moved to the blanket, gently lifting the pup's head as he spoke softly, hoping to rouse it. "Come on, little one," he whispered, his voice low and soothing. "Just a little more. You've made it this far." The puppy's eyes fluttered open, its gaze unfocused, but it was looking at him. For a moment, Grant held his breath, wondering if it would be able to rise up from the brink. Slowly, the puppy shifted its small body, its legs trembling with weakness. Grant knew this was a critical moment. If the pup couldn't get up, if it couldn't move and start eating and drinking again, it might not survive. "Come on, I know you can do it." Grant urged gently, his hand brushing the pup's fur. The little dog gave a soft groan, its body shaking as it tried to lift itself, struggling against the overwhelming exhaustion that weighed it down. It wasn't much, but it was something, a sign that it still had the will to live. Grant sat back, allowing the puppy some space to gather itself, watching as the tiny creature fought to regain its strength. For what felt like an eternity, the pup remained still, its breathing shallow. Then finally, after what seemed like hours, the puppy's small head lifted again, its eyes clearer, now more focused. It let out a small bark, weak but determined. A flicker of hope surged in Grant's chest. The puppy was alive. It was fighting. It was still in the game. He exhaled, relieved, but he knew the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, the wind howling with fury, the snow swirling relentlessly. The temperature continued to drop, and the cabin, though warm, was just a small oasis in the middle of a frozen world. Grant's eyes drifted to the window, where the snow piled up against the glass, inch by inch, the storm still raging. The conditions outside were lethal. There was no way the puppy could survive out there, not in this storm, not in this cold. But inside, Grant had done everything he could to give it a chance. The puppy's body had responded to the warmth, and its breath had deepened, the labored gasps becoming more regular. Grant leaned forward and grabbed the bowl of water again, gently coaxing it to drink. The puppy hesitated for a moment, but then it lapped at the water, weak but eager to drink. Grant smiled faintly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Slowly, the puppy seemed to gain more strength, its eyes becoming brighter, its body less stiff. Grant took a deep breath, letting his shoulders relax for the first time since he had found the pup outside. Maybe, just maybe, they had a shot at making it through the night. As the fire burned low in the hearth, Grant settled back into his chair, his eyes never leaving the puppy. He kept his hands within reach, ready to help if it needed him, but he also gave it space, allowing it to find its own strength. There was no need to rush this. The storm could wait. The puppy could wait. The bond that had begun to form between them felt real, undeniable, like something deep inside him was awakening. This little creature, this small, vulnerable puppy, had become more than just a casualty of a storm. It had become a part of him. And as Grant watched it slowly but surely recovering, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. The storm had reached its peak, and now slowly began to subside. Grant had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and everything in him told him that this moment was critical. He had seen enough of life and death to know that survival wasn't just about being lucky. It was about the choices you made when it counted, about the effort you put in when things seemed hopeless. And now, with the puppy's life hanging by a thread, it was clear that the little dog needed more than just warmth and water. It needed to find the will to live, to push past the exhaustion and weakness that had nearly consumed it. Grant leaned forward, watching the puppy as it slowly lifted its head. Its eyes were still unfocused, its body too weak to hold itself up for long, but it was alive and fighting. The connection between them, however small it seemed, felt stronger than anything Grant had ever known. He couldn't explain it. It was just something that clicked, as if the storm outside and the fierce struggle for survival inside were two sides of the same coin. The puppy needed him, and he needed it. The thought was strange, but it was undeniable. The cabin was quiet, except for the crackling of the fire and the faint whine of the wind outside. Grant stood up, his muscles sore from sitting so long, and walked to the window. He glanced out at the snow now piled high against the glass. The night was falling, and the storm had left a desolate landscape in its wake. The thought of the world beyond the cabin felt distant now, removed from the urgency of the moment. He couldn't control what was happening out there. But in here, in this small, dimly lit cabin, he could fight for the puppy's life. He could make sure it survived this night. The puppy shifted again, this time with more purpose, trying to move its legs, struggling to find its feet. It let out a soft, pitiful growl, a sound that tugged at Grant's heart. It was a sound of frustration, of determination, a tiny voice in the vastness of the storm. "That's it," Grant muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've got this." He knelt down beside the puppy, his hands gentle as he lifted it carefully, cradling its fragile body in his arms. The small creature was light, almost too light, its bones sharp against Grant's palms. He knew it hadn't eaten in a while, maybe not since before the storm had begun. He could feel the weight of the pup's vulnerability, the way it depended on him completely, and the responsibility felt heavy. Grant moved slowly, ensuring the puppy felt safe as he laid it gently on the blanket again. The fire in front of them crackled, as if in encouragement. The puppy's eyes flickered again, its small tail moving ever so slightly. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Good girl, Grant whispered the words, leaving his mouth before he could think. The connection between them felt more real with each passing minute. The puppy was starting to respond to him, starting to fight back. He could see it in the way it shifted, in the way it tried to lift its head when it heard his voice. He knew it was still weak, still struggling, but Grant wasn't going to let up. He reached for a small dish of milk he had kept aside, careful not to spill it. He had no idea if the puppy would be able to drink much, but he had to try. He couldn't afford to let it fade away in front of him. The puppy hesitated, its eyes still cloudy with exhaustion, but then, as if sensing the offer of help, it gave a soft whimper. The sound was weak, but it was enough to make Grant's heart skip a beat. He gently held the bowl to the puppy's lips, guiding it carefully. The puppy sniffed at the milk, then licked at it, its tongue weak but insistent. Grant smiled softly, his heart swelling with a sense of pride. It wasn't much, but it was the beginning of the pup's recovery. Slowly, carefully, the puppy drank a little more, its small body taking in the nourishment. With every sip, it seemed to gain just a fraction more energy. After a few minutes, Grant set the bowl aside, watching the puppy settle back into the blanket. It looked up at him again, its eyes clearer now, more focused, though still exhausted. The journey was far from over, but this was a start. And for the first time, Grant allowed himself to believe that the little pup might just make it. He leaned back in his chair, watching the firelight dance in the dim room, and let out a long breath. The storm outside had finally begun to die down, leaving only the eerie quiet of a world frozen in time. Grant couldn't help but watch it, his eyes never leaving the pup for long. It had been hours since the storm had subsided, but the night outside remained unforgiving, the wind still howling like a lost soul, rattling the windows with a force that seemed endless. The snow had piled high outside, leaving the world outside the cabin buried beneath a thick, frozen blanket. But inside there was warmth from the fire, and warmth from the connection he had begun to feel with the puppy. Despite the intensity of the storm, despite the raw cold that had nearly claimed the puppy's life, there was a fragile hope in the air, now something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for a long time. Grant leaned forward, his gaze never leaving the puppy. It still hadn't moved much, its body still too weak to make any real progress, but the signs were there. The soft twitching of its tail, the occasional flicker of its eyes, the way it now took small, measured breaths instead of the shallow, frantic gasps it had been making earlier, all signs of life, all signs of recovery. Grant had spent enough time in the wild to know that the struggle for survival wasn't a clear path. There were moments of hope, followed by moments of despair, and sometimes the line between the two could be razor thin. But he had fought too many battles in his life to let this one slip through his fingers. He wouldn't let it go without a fight. The puppy's small body stirred again, its legs shifting weakly beneath it. Grant could feel the air in the room grow heavier, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. For a moment it seemed as though the puppy was going to give in to its exhaustion, that the effort to move would prove too much. But then it let out a soft growl, a tiny, desperate sound that tugged at Grant's heart. The puppy was trying. It was still fighting. That's when Grant knew it wasn't over yet. Slowly, carefully, he moved closer, sitting down beside the puppy. He spoke to it softly, his voice low and steady. trying to reassure it as much as he was reassuring himself. "Come on, little one," he murmured. "You're doing great. Just a little longer." The puppy's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time since Grant had found it outside, there was something clear in its gaze. It wasn't much, just a flicker of awareness, but it was enough. Enough to make Grant believe that the puppy might just make it. The fire crackled behind him, casting dancing shadows across the walls. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still, the storm outside, the quiet of the cabin, the steady rise and fall of the puppy's chest. Time slowed down, and in that space there was only the two of them, the veteran who had lived through a lifetime of loss and survival, and the small creature that had found its way to him in the most unlikely of circumstances. Grant reached out slowly, gently, stroking the puppy's fur, his hand careful not to startle it. It was still so fragile, so vulnerable, but in that moment it wasn't about strength. It was about survival, and the puppy was learning bit by bit that survival was within its reach. The minutes passed, and the puppy's body grew warmer, its limbs less stiff. Grant watched as the little dog's eyes stayed open longer, as it began to blink more regularly. It had moved from just surviving to actively engaging with the world around it. This small change, this subtle shift, was a victory in itself. Grant leaned back in his chair, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and relief wash over him. The battle was far from over, but they had made it through the first test. The storm had passed, and the night was slowly moving toward dawn. He had no idea how long it would take for the puppy to fully recover, or if it even would. But he knew that for now they were both here. They were both alive. The fire burned lower now, the embers glowing faintly in the hearth. Grant sat quietly, watching the small, fragile creature beside him. The puppy's head shifted, resting on the blanket, and for a moment it looked up at him with a faint, trusting gaze. Grant smiled softly, though the expression was tinged with sadness. He had spent so many years keeping his distance from everything, keeping himself buried in the past. But now, with the puppy at his side, he felt a sense of connection he hadn't realized he was missing. The storm outside might have been fierce, but inside there was a quiet peace. The warmth from the fire seemed to settle into Grant's bones, easing the tension that had been building for hours. It was as if for the first time in a long time he could breathe. The puppy's soft sigh pulled him back to reality. It was still so small, so fragile, but it was fighting. And in that fight there was something Grant could understand, something he could hold on to. The connection between them was simple, one of survival, of dependence, but it was real. And that was all that mattered now. The storm outside had passed, but the fight for the puppy's life was far from over. Grant wouldn't stop. As the first rays of dawn broke through the small cabin window, Grant Harlan found himself gazing at the tiny German Shepherd puppy that had come into his life under the most unlikely circumstances. The fire had burned low, leaving behind only the faint glow of embers, but the warmth it provided had filled the cabin with a quiet comfort. The storm had passed, and the world outside was still blanketed in snow, the once violent wind now reduced to nothing more than a soft whisper. Grant had been awake for hours, watching the puppy as it slept peacefully on the blanket, its tiny body no longer shivering, its breathing deep and steady. The change from the fragile creature he had found at his door to the small but growing life that lay before him was nothing short of miraculous. The warmth of the cabin, the milk he had fed it, the care he had provided, and the resilience of the puppy itself had all combined to give it a fighting chance. But Grant knew that there was still a long way to go. The puppy wasn't out of the woods yet. It was weak, still recovering from the trauma of the storm and the exhaustion it had endured, but it was alive. That fact alone gave Grant hope. He stood up slowly, stretching his stiff limbs, and walked over to the window. The landscape outside had changed drastically in the few hours since the storm had passed. The world was still buried in snow, the mountains surrounding the cabin coated in a thick white blanket, and the trees stood tall, their branches heavy with ice. The sun had risen, casting a pale light over everything, but the air remained crisp. biting a reminder of how close they had come to losing the battle. The temperature had dropped overnight, and Grant knew that they had narrowly escaped disaster. If the puppy had been left outside much longer, it wouldn't have survived. His thoughts drifted back to the moment when he had first found the little creature shivering and near death on his doorstep. He had never imagined that something so small could survive in such conditions. It had been a fight from the start, a fight for warmth, for life. And now, as he stood by the window looking out at the peaceful scene before him, he realized that the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He turned away from the window and walked back to the puppy, his heart swelling with a strange sense of connection. The little dog had done something to him, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the act of saving its life, though, that was important. It was something deeper. The puppy had reminded him of the power of survival, of the strength that lay within even the smallest creatures. And in the process, it had brought him back to life in a way. For so long, Grant had kept his distance from everything people memories, the world outside his cabin. He had come to believe that solitude was the answer, that isolation was safer, more peaceful. But in this quiet cabin with the tiny puppy at his side, Grant realized that peace didn't come from being alone. It came from connection. It came from fighting for something, fighting together, even if that fight was against something as simple as a brutal storm. Grant knelt down beside the puppy, his hand gently brushing its fur. It stirred slightly, its small body shifting under the blanket, and for the first time it looked up at him with clear, focused eyes. There was a spark of recognition in its gaze, something that made Grant's heart skip a beat. The little dog was still weak, but it had made it through the worst. And now, as it looked up at him, Grant knew that they were bound together. The bond between them wasn't just about the puppy's survival. It was about the shared experience of fighting for life, of holding on when everything seemed lost. It was about finding strength in each other in the most unlikely of places. The puppy's small tail twitched, its tiny body shifting once more, and Grant smiled softly. It wasn't much, but it was progress. The signs of life were becoming more evident with each passing minute. The puppy was starting to trust him, starting to realize that it was safe, that it had a chance now. The storm outside might have been fierce, but inside they had found refuge. Grant reached for the bowl of milk that had been set aside earlier, holding it gently in front of the puppy. The little dog sniffed at the bowl before dipping its head down to take a cautious drink. Grant watched, his heart swelling with pride as the puppy lapped at the milk, its movements slow but determined. It wasn't the frantic drinking from before, when the puppy had been too weak to care for itself. This was different. This was the beginning of recovery. This was the start of a new chapter for them both. As the puppy drank, Grant couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. He had spent so much of his life in the service fighting battles. He didn't always understand making choices that had left him scarred and distant. But this small creature, this tiny, fragile puppy, had reminded him that there was more to life than just surviving. It was about connection, about holding on to the things that mattered, no matter how small or fleeting they seemed. The connection between them had grown over the hours. The puppy, still weak, had begun to trust him more, its gaze following his every move, its small body seeking out the warmth of his presence. Grant had never thought much about animals before, always more focused on survival and solitude. But now, with this small, fragile creature relying on him, something had shifted within him. It wasn't just about saving a life anymore. It was about something deeper, something that reached beyond the surface of the simple task of survival. It was about caring about the bonds that formed when two lives collided, when both fought for the same thing, life. As night fell and the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Grant found himself unable to stop watching the puppy. He had sat by the fire for hours, the warmth of the flames settling into his weary bones, but his eyes kept drifting back to the small form curled up on the blanket. It still looked fragile, its body a little too thin, its fur still patchy from the cold. But it was breathing steadily now, its chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic pattern. The storm outside had stopped, the howling wind, replaced by the eerie silence that always followed a fierce blizzard. The world seemed frozen in time, a blanket of snow covering everything, as though the land itself had taken a deep breath and held it. Grant didn't know how long it had been since he had been alone like this. Years, maybe. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to care for anything, years since he'd truly felt connected to someone or something. The past had always been a heavy weight on his chest, and the isolation he had chosen in the aftermath of his service had felt like the only way to keep the memories at bay. But now, with the puppy at his side, something had changed. The walls he had built around himself were beginning to crack, the fortress he had erected to protect his heart from the world outside starting to crumble. The puppy was still small, still weak, but it was fighting. And Grant realized in that moment that it wasn't just the puppy fighting to survive. It was him, too. He had been fighting for so long, fighting to forget, fighting to stay numb, fighting to keep his heart locked away from the world. But now, with the puppy depending on him, he was learning to fight for something else, for connection, for life. It was a quiet kind of battle, but it was no less real. The puppy stirred in its sleep, its small body shifting beneath the blankets. Grant's heart skipped a beat as he watched it. The once ragged, shallow breaths had deepened into a steady rhythm, the tiny tail now wagging faintly with each movement. He couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. The puppy was recovering. It wasn't out of the woods yet, but it had come a long way from the fragile, frozen creature he had found on his doorstep hours ago. It had strength he hadn't seen before, a resilience that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. The night stretched on the fire, burning low, and Grant sat beside the puppy, keeping watch. It was strange, this new role he had found himself in: caretaker, protector, companion. It wasn't what he had expected when he'd come to Montana all those years ago, seeking solace in the wilderness away from the world that had left its mark on him. But now, in the quiet of the cabin, with the puppy resting peacefully beside him, he realized that this was what he had been missing all along. The puppy let out a soft whine in its sleep, its small body twitching, as if it were chasing something in its dreams. Grant smiled faintly, his hand moving to gently stroke the puppy's fur. It was an automatic gesture, one that had become almost second nature to him now. The warmth of the fire, the quiet of the cabin, the steady breathing of the puppy, it was all so peaceful, so calm. But even in this moment of peace, Grant couldn't forget the storm outside. The battle for survival wasn't over yet. The puppy had come close to death. It had been on the brink, and Grant knew that the path to full recovery was still uncertain. He had done everything he could for now, provided warmth, food, water, but there was more to survival than just that. The puppy needed time, it needed rest, and it needed strength. Grant settled back into his chair, his thoughts drifting as he looked out at the stillness beyond the window. The landscape outside was untouched, the snow smooth and unbroken, a world frozen in time. Inside the cabin, however, things were beginning to change. The warmth from the fire and the soft sound of the puppy's breathing seemed to fill the empty space around him, easing the loneliness that had become so familiar over the years. Grant reached down and adjusted the blanket around the puppy, making sure it was warm enough. He had no idea how long it would take for the puppy to fully recover, or if it ever would. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't worried about the future. He wasn't concerned with what might happen. The cabin was silent, except for the faint crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the puppy as it lay nestled in the blankets, its small body now visibly stronger. The storm had long passed, and the world outside was still buried beneath a thick layer of snow, untouched and serene in the early morning light. Grant stood near the window, gazing out at the pristine landscape. The snow had settled the air crisp and fresh, the wind a faint whisper compared to the fierce howling it had been just hours earlier. For the first time in a long while, the landscape seemed almost welcoming, peaceful, as if the world had given them a brief respite from the chaos. Grant had been awake for a while, just watching the puppy, listening to the soft rhythm of its breathing. He felt a strange sense of pride for this little creature that had somehow found its way to him, for the strength it had shown despite the odds. The small German shepherd had come so close to dying in the storm, but here it was still alive, still fighting. Grant moved back to the fire, stoking the flames higher to keep the warmth in the room steady. The light from the fire flickered across the room, casting long shadows against the wooden walls. As he walked back to the puppy, he found himself surprised by the bond that had already formed between them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something that transcended the simple need for warmth and food. This puppy, this fragile creature had come into his life at a time when he needed it most, even though he hadn't realized it. The days of isolation had taken their toll on him, leaving him distant from everything he once cared about. He had built walls around his heart, keeping people's emotions and memories at bay. But the puppy had shattered those walls piece by piece, and in doing so had given Grant something he had almost forgotten. He needed a reason to care, a reason to fight. The puppy stirred slightly, letting out a soft whine, and Grant knelt beside it. He could feel the warmth radiating from its body now, a stark contrast to the ice-cold creature he had found just a day ago. The small, fragile animal had come so far in such a short time. It was still weak, but it was making progress. As Grant watched it, his hand gently stroking the puppy's fur, he noticed that its eyes were open wider, now its gaze more focused. The cloudy, distant look it had earlier was gone, replaced by a glimmer of awareness. It was still wobbly, still unsteady, but the fight was evident in its every move. The recovery wasn't going to be quick, and Grant knew that it would take more than just food and warmth to restore the puppy to full health. It would take time. But that wasn't something Grant was afraid of. Time had never mattered much to him before, but now, with the puppy at his side, he had learned that every second counted. He needed to be patient, just as the puppy needed to be. As the morning light filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the cabin, the puppy's small body began to stir again. It shifted in the blankets, its legs twitching as if it were trying to stand. Grant's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting this moment, knowing that the puppy needed to take the next step literally and figuratively. The little dog let out a soft, tentative growl as it struggled to push itself upright, its legs shaking as if they had forgotten how to hold its weight. Grant moved closer, crouching beside the puppy, ready to offer support, but he didn't want to rush it. He wanted the puppy to do this on its own, to find its strength. The small dog's body wobbled, but it didn't give up. It tried again, its tiny paws pushing against the blanket beneath it, and with a shaky movement it managed to lift itself onto its legs. For a brief moment the puppy stood there, shaky and unsteady, its legs trembling with the effort. Grant held his breath, watching in awe as the puppy found its balance. And then, with a soft whine, the puppy took its first step. It was slow, uncoordinated, but it was a step, a real step. Grant couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a sign that the puppy was moving forward, that it was ready to fight for its place in the world. Grant's heart swelled with pride as he watched the small animal take another step, its tiny paws shaky but determined. He knew that the road ahead would still be difficult, that the puppy would face many more challenges before it was fully recovered. But in that moment, there was hope. The puppy wasn't just surviving anymore. It was living. It was finding its way back to strength, and Grant was right there beside it, ready to help it take whatever steps it needed. The fire crackled softly in the background as Grant moved to kneel beside the puppy, offering a hand of support as it took another shaky step forward. This time the little dog didn't hesitate. It moved with more confidence, though still unsure. Grant's hand rested gently on its back, steadying it, but he knew that this moment, this first step, was about more than just physical recovery. It was about trust. The puppy trusted him now, and that trust was something Grant hadn't expected to find, especially not in the midst of the storm. It was a small thing, a step forward in the right direction, but it meant everything. Grant let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The puppy was going to make it. The days had passed in a blur of routine, with Grant waking each morning to tend to the puppy's needs. The once feeble creature was slowly growing stronger, its movements more deliberate and less shaky. It was hard to believe that only a few days ago it had been nothing more than a frozen, shivering bundle of fur lying lifeless on the doorstep. Now it was a small, determined dog, its tail wagging more often than not, its eyes brighter with each passing hour. Grant had seen it take its first steps with a mixture of awe and relief, and now, as the puppy grew more confident, he found himself watching it with a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. The bond between them had deepened, though neither of them spoke the words out loud. It wasn't necessary. The connection they shared was something unspoken, something that neither of them needed to put into words. In a way, they understood each other more now than they ever had before. The puppy was still young, still learning about the world around it, but it had come a long way. Its fur was thicker, now no longer matted from the cold, and its body was beginning to fill out. The hunger that had once hollowed its stomach seemed to have subsided, and it was now more alert, more energetic. Grant had even caught it trying to play its small, hesitant barks echoing in the cabin as it chased after the odd sock or piece of wood that had been tossed for it. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For the first time, the cabin felt alive with energy, a stark contrast to the eerie stillness that had settled over it in the days before. But even as the puppy grew stronger, Grant couldn't help but reflect on the strange turn of events that had brought them here. He had never asked for a companion, never expected to find himself caring for an animal in the way he now did. He had come to Montana to escape the ghosts of his past, to live in isolation, to leave the world behind. But somehow this small dog had found him, and in doing so had forced him to confront everything he had been running from. Grant knew the puppy wasn't just a lifeline for him. It was a reminder of something he had long buried deep inside himself, the capacity for care, for connection. He had spent so much of his life pushing others away, keeping people at arm's length, building walls to protect himself from the hurt that came with caring too much. But in the puppy's eyes, he saw a kind of purity, a kind of trust that he had long forgotten how to give or receive. The soft glow of the fire illuminated the puppy's face as it lay next to Grant, its head resting on its paws, its small body relaxed and comfortable in the warmth. Grant reached down and gently ran his hand through its fur, the familiar sensation bringing a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. The puppy looked up at him, its gaze steady, and for a moment there was a quiet understanding between them. The past few days had been filled with moments of tenderness and care, but they had also been filled with reflection. Grant had spent much of his time thinking about the choices he had made, the path that had led him to this point. He had always been a man of action, of duty, of survival. But now, as he sat in the quiet of the cabin with the puppy beside him, he realized that there was more to life than just surviving. There was living. There was connection. There was giving and receiving and sharing the burden of the struggle. He had spent years locked in his own mind, reliving the battles of his past, trying to make sense of the things he had lost. But the puppy had reminded him that there was more to life than the past. There was a future that he could shape if he allowed himself to. The small dog shifted in its sleep, its body pressing closer to Grant's leg, seeking comfort and warmth. Grant smiled softly, a deep sense of contentment washing over him. He had never thought he would find himself in this position, caring for something so vulnerable, something so dependent on him. But in this moment he realized that this was exactly where he needed to be. It was a strange thought, a thought he would have never entertained a few days ago. But now, with the puppy beside him, it felt natural. As the fire flickered and the room grew quieter, Grant closed his eyes for a moment, letting the stillness wash over him. The world outside might still be cold and unforgiving, but inside the cabin there was warmth, there was peace, and there was hope. The puppy had taught him that it was okay to care, that it was okay to let someone in. He had spent so long running from the world, afraid of the hurt it could cause. But now he saw that the real danger wasn't in caring, it was in shutting everything out. The puppy had taught him to embrace the world again, to let go of the fear that had kept him locked away. It wasn't easy. The scars of the past didn't vanish overnight, and the road ahead would still be difficult. But in that moment, with the small, trusting dog by his side, Grant realized that he was no longer alone in his struggle. They were both survivors in their own way, and together they would face whatever came next. The days stretched on, and the small German Shepherd puppy continued to grow stronger with each passing day. The fire still crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room, and the cabin had become a place of life, of healing, and of hope. Grant had spent his days caring for the puppy, watching it recover and flourish, and he could see in its eyes the trust it had placed in him. It wasn't just a survivor anymore. It was a fighter, a creature full of energy and spirit. It had come from the brink of death, had fought through the storm and the cold, and now it was thriving, full of life. As the puppy grew stronger, so did Grant. He had found something in the small creature that he hadn't realized. He had been missing something that had been buried beneath years of pain and solitude. It was purpose. It was connection. For so long he had isolated himself from the world, from the people he had once known, choosing instead the silence of the mountains and the distance of his cabin. He had been content, or so he thought, to live alone, disconnected from the world. But now, with the puppy by his side, he realized that he had been lying to himself. He had spent too much time running from the past, from the memories that haunted him. But the puppy had shown him that the past didn't define him. What mattered was the present, what he chose to do in this moment. And in this moment he was choosing to live again. The puppy had given him that gift without even realizing it. It had reminded him that it was okay to care, that it was okay to feel, to trust. It had shown him that life wasn't just about surviving. It was about living fully, about embracing the world around you, no matter how harsh or unforgiving it might seem. Grant stood up slowly, stretching his sore muscles, and walked to the window. The snow had finally stopped falling, and the world outside was still and peaceful, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The mountains were blanketed in white, their peaks touching the sky, and the air was crisp and clean, the kind of air that made you feel alive. He felt a sense of calm wash over him, a quiet peace that he hadn't felt in years. The storm was over. The long, bitter winter had passed, and though there would be challenges ahead, Grant knew that they would face them together. He glanced back at the puppy, who was now playing by the fire, its tail wagging excitedly as it pounced on a stray piece of wood. It was full of energy, now its small body strong and healthy, its movements quick and coordinated. It had come so far from the frail, shivering creature that had stumbled into his life, and Grant couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. The journey had been difficult, but it had been worth it. They had both been tested in ways they never expected, but they had both come through stronger. The road ahead was still uncertain, but that was the nature of life. There were no guarantees, no promises of a smooth path. But Grant knew now that he didn't need to be afraid of what came next. He had the strength to face it, and so did the puppy. Together they had survived. Together they had found something worth fighting for. And that was all that mattered. The puppy's bark interrupted his thoughts, and Grant turned to see the small dog looking up at him, its eyes bright with excitement. It wagged its tail and bounded toward him, its energy infectious. Grant smiled and knelt down, letting the puppy lick his hand before scooping it up into his arms. As he held the small animal, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a sense of connection to something greater than himself. He wasn't alone anymore. He had someone to share this life with, someone to fight for, someone who depended on him. And in turn, the puppy had someone to care for it, someone to guide it through the challenges of life. Grant knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, that there would be hardships and struggles along the way. But with the puppy by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. He had found a new purpose, a new sense of belonging. The puppy had given him that, and for that he was forever grateful. Together they would walk into the future side by side, and whatever came their way, they would face it together. The fire burned low in the hearth, the shadows in the cabin stretching long as the night began to fall. Grant sat back down, the puppy curling up in his lap, content and at peace. He stroked its fur gently, his hand steady as he thought about the journey they had been on. It had been a difficult journey full of obstacles and challenges, but it had also been a beautiful one. They had both found something they hadn't known they were missing each other. And in that, Grant realized that sometimes the hardest battles lead to the greatest rewards. The storm had come, but it had passed. And now in the quiet aftermath, there was only the promise of a new day, a new beginning, a beginning that they would face together. The end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming content. Let us know in the comments what you thought of the plot, and feel free to share where you're watching from. We love hearing from you.